Every human culture ever found, every single one, has produced religion. The ones separated by oceans, the ones that never knew the others existed, the ones that spent thousands of years in complete isolation with no way of borrowing the idea from anywhere else. All of them looked up at the sky or down at the dead or out at the darkness beyond the fire and reached for something they couldn't see. We have never found a human society that didn't do this. Not one, not anywhere, not at any point in history. Every culture we have excavated, every civilization we have ever studied, every isolated population we have ever encountered, all of them, without exception, reached for something beyond the visible world. That is either the most important fact about our species or it is a very elaborate accident. And I don't think it's an accident. Iraq, 1960, a researcher named Ralph Selinki is deep inside a cave in the north of the country, the Sandahar Cave, working in the dark, brushing soil away from bones that have been lying there for 40,000 years. What he finds stops him. A Neanderthal, our nearest cousin, not a modern human, a creature we barely consider fully one of us, separated from us by a vast gulf of time and evolution. And this one has been placed in the earth with extraordinary care on its side, knees drawn up. And around the bones, someone had laid flowers, clustered pollen from 8 species of flowering plants, several with known medicinal properties. 40,000 years ago, in a cave, someone gathered flowers for their dead. Whatever that was, it was not nothing, something that old, that deliberate, that tender. It does not come from nowhere. The flower burial has been disputed ever since. Maybe rodents carried the seeds in. Maybe the soil was contaminated from above. You can hold that specific case loosely if you want to. What you cannot hold loosely is the pattern it sits inside. Everywhere humans appear in the archaeological record, the dead are treated differently from anything else. Not disposed of, honoured, objects placed beside them, positions chosen deliberately, ground marked above, things done for someone who can no longer feel them, by people who know them, with complete certainty that they will one day be in exactly the same position. And they do it anyway, in every culture, without being taught to by anyone outside their own community. The anthropologist Donald Brown catalogued features present in every known human society, without exception: language, music, religious belief, every culture, no exceptions ever. Something in us has always believed the story doesn't end with the body, and that belief is as old as we are. In the late 1990s, a neuroscientist named Andrew Newberg started doing something nobody had quite done before. He put people in brain scanners while they were in the middle of deep religious experience. Tibetan Buddhist monks in the peak of meditation, Franciscan nuns at the height of prayer. Different traditions, different beliefs, different languages for what they were going through. People who had spent decades practicing entirely different paths towards the same interior destination. Same result every time. A region of the brain that maintains the boundary between self and world went quiet. The experience that those people described of dissolving into something larger, of touching something real and vast, of the self becoming briefly unbounded, showed up in the scan. You could see it. It was physical, neurologically real, whatever it was pointing at. What do you do with that? The skeptic's answer deserves to be taken seriously. The brain evolved to detect agency, to assume that events have intentions behind them, a sound in the undergrowth, wind, or something that wants to eat you. The brain that presumed predator survived more often than the brain that shrugged and went back to sleep. So, over millions of years, we became wired to overdetect, to find purpose and presence and meaning even when there is none. Faces in clouds, intent behind storms, gods behind everything. Religion on this account is just what that hardware produces as a side effect, a ghost the machine generates entirely for itself. That argument has genuine force, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. But the eye evolved too, and nobody uses that fact to argue the things we see with it aren't real. Where a capacity came from and what it is reaching toward are two completely different questions, and quietly collapsing them into one is where the dismissal goes wrong every time. January 6th, 1937, the Soviet Union runs a census. One of the questions, do you believe in God? Picture what that means to answer that honestly. You are a Soviet citizen in 1937. The Great Terror is at its height. People are disappearing for less. The state has ears in every building, informants on every floor, and the census has your name on it. Your name, your address, your answer. The Soviet state had spent 20 years trying to erase religion from hundreds of millions of people. 40,000 churches demolished or converted into warehouses and swimming pools, clergy arrested, exiled, shot. An entire state organization, the League of the Militant Godless, existing solely to run active campaigns against belief. Atheism compulsory in every school from the very first year. This was not a half hearted effort. This was the full industrial weight of a totalitarian state applied with complete conviction for 2 decades straight. The census came back. 57% said yes. Stalin suppressed it immediately, had those responsible for the census arrested. Several were shot because that number wasn't supposed to be possible. It represented a catastrophic failure of everything the state had been trying to do, and they knew it. The same experiment ran in Maoist China, in Albania, the only country in history to formally declare itself a constitutional state of atheism, and in Cambodia, under the Khmer Rouge. Every time that pattern held, you could close every institution, you could make public belief a death sentence. You could scrub it from every school, every book, every public space. What you could not do, what none of these steps, with all their power and all their determination, ever manage, was to make it stop. The most powerful atheist project in human history ran for most of the 20th century, and it failed. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Russian Orthodox Church didn't need to be rebuilt from nothing. It had been living in kitchens, in whispered prayers after dark, passed quietly between grandparents and grandchildren in secret for 70 years, while the full force of the state tried to kill it. Not weakened, not diluted, waiting. The moment the pressure lifted, it walked back out into the open. Think about what kind of thing survives like that. People chose this at the cost of their lives, ordinary people in ordinary apartments, keeping something alive that the most powerful and determined state apparatus in history could not extinguish. That is not the behavior of people following a tradition they've never examined. That is the behavior of people who found something they could not let go of because, in some way they couldn't always articulate, it would not let go of them. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have the oldest traditional culture on Earth, between 50,000 and 65,000 years of unbroken habitation, not migration and replacement, continuous. The same people, the same accumulated memory carried forward without interruption across a time span that is genuinely difficult to hold in your mind. All of recorded human history, from the first writing in ancient Mesopotamia to this moment, is roughly 5,000 years. This culture is more than 10 times older than that. Every empire Rome ever built, every dynasty Egypt ever produced, every civilization the ancient world ever raised and watched fall, all of it fits inside a fraction of what we are talking about. And woven through every single year of it is the dreaming, a layer of reality beneath the physical world, The land spiritually alive, every mountain and river carrying the memory of how the world came to be, not borrowed from anywhere, built entirely alone in total isolation from every other tradition on earth. This is not one tradition influencing another. There was no contact, no shared origin, no trade route carrying the idea across the water. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia arrived at that same fundamental conviction that the visible world is not the whole story, that something sacred runs beneath the surface of things, independently, in complete isolation, and held it without interruption for 50,000 years. To explain that away, you have to believe the brain keeps pointing at something that isn't there, reliably, everywhere, in every culture, in populations that never met each other, across the entire span of human history, and that this pattern tells us nothing at all. That is a position you can hold. But ask yourself honestly which requires more faith: believing the signal is noise, or believing that something kept pointing the same way in every direction at every moment in history because something was actually there to point at. C.S. Lewis spent the first half of his life as a committed atheist. Sharp, rigorous, genuinely hard to fool, not the kind of person who needed comforting stories. And the thing that eventually cracked his skepticism open wasn't an argument someone put to him. It was something he noticed in his own experience, quietly, over a long time, that he could not account for. Human beings carried longings that nothing in this world can satisfy. The first moment you fell in love, and something in that moment seemed to promise more than any love could ever actually deliver. The piece of music that reached into you and almost touched something that you can't name or locate. The longing that arrives sometimes at the most ordinary moments for something just beyond reach, something you can feel the shape of without being able to say what it is. What is that? Where is it aimed? And why does it never go away? Lewis was precise about what that meant. In the natural world, desire and its object exist together. Hunger exists because food exists. The instinct to swim exists because water exists. You don't find creatures built with appetites for things that have no counterpart anywhere in reality. Nature doesn't wire you for something that isn't there. So when Lewis found in himself a longing that nothing in this world could fill, not love, not achievement, not beauty, not any experience this life could offer, he took it seriously as evidence. Not proof, evidence, a desire that consistently exceeds every earthly thing offered to satisfy it, is probably not aimed at anything earthly. And if he was right, if the longing is real and the object of it is real, then the universal human reach towards something beyond the visible world starts to look less like a malfunction and more like a compass, imperfect, inconsistent, but pointing persistently in the right direction. In caves across the world, France, Spain, Indonesia, Australia, wherever archaeologists go looking, they find the same mark pressed into the rock. Not animals, not maps, human hands. The painter placed their hand flat against the stone, blew pigment around the edges, and left. No signature, no explanation, just the mark of a hand, and then the silence for 45,000 years. The oldest confirmed examples are over 45,000 years old, which means that before we had cities, before we had writing, before we had any of the things we think of as civilization, we had this. We were pressing our hands against stone in the dark and speaking to something we couldn't see. Whoever made those marks weren't just recording that they existed, they were addressing something, reaching towards something outside themselves in the only language they had. I am here. I am here. Someone, something, I am here. Every culture, every continent, every period of human history, that gesture over and over and over again. The Soviet state couldn't stop it. 50,000 years of isolation couldn't stop it. Nothing in the entire span of human history has ever stopped it. Lewis would say those hands were reaching for their true country, that the longing encoded in that gesture is the most honest thing about us, the one appetite that points beyond the world because it was made for something beyond the world. The neuroscientist would say the brain was running its program in the dark, firing at its own reflection. They are both looking at the same hands. When I look at those marks pressed into the stone 45,000 years ago in the dark, with no way of knowing if anyone would ever find them, I think they knew something we keep trying to argue ourselves out of. Is there anyone there to receive it? I believe the answer is yes.